Hei og velkommen til Palestinapodden. I denne episoden får du høre et opptak av et live-arrangement på Litteraturhuset den 11.9., arrangert av SAIH og Klassekampen. Resten av introduksjonen får du nå høre fra Selma fra SAIH, så velkommen til en
spennende samtale mellom den israelske akademikeren og forfatteren Maya Wind og samfunnsforsker og Klassekampen-spaltist Olav Elgvin, som faktisk også oppvokst i Israel. Mitt navn Selma Brattberg, og jeg leder av studentene og akademikernes internasjonale hjelpefond, SAIH. I snart 1 år så har Gaza vært under konstant angrep. Vi har vært og fremdeles vitne til en bevisst og politisk menneskeskapt humanitær katastrofe uten sidestykke i moderne historie. For oss i SAIH, som jobber for akademisk frihet og tilgang til høyere utdanning, det også skremmende å være vitne til det som har blitt beskrevet av flere som scholasticide. Begrepet refererer til en systematisk ødeleggelse av utdanning gjennom arrestasjon, fengsling eller drap på lærere, studenter og ansatte, samt ødeleggelsen av utdanningsinfrastruktur. I løpet av det siste året så har alle universiteter i Gaza blitt bombet. Over 500 lærere, professorer og undervisere, og over 10 000 studenter og elever drept. Over 500 skolebygg har blitt angrepet. En stor gruppe FN-eksperter fastholder at de ulike angrepene på utdanningssektoren i Gaza ikke isolerte hendelser, men en del av et systematisk mønster av vold rettet mot å ødelegge selve grunnlaget for det palestinske samfunnet. På Vestbredden også høyere utdanningssektoren under enormt press. Universitetsområder blir invadert. Nå senest Birzeit-universitetet utenfor Ramallah, som ble invadert på nytt forrige uke. Studenter blir arrestert, og den akademiske friheten for palestinske studenter og akademikere kraftig begrenset. Dette minner oss på at angrepene på det palestinske utdanningssystemet ikke begrenset til Gaza, og at det ikke startet i oktober 2023. Utdanningsinstitusjoner i Palestina har alltid operert under okkupasjon, og fortsetter å operere, selv om de fysiske bygningene blir bombet i stykker. Gjennom boka Towers of Ivory and Steel, How Israeli Universities Deny Palestinian Freedom, retter Maya Wind søkelyset mot høyere utdanningssektoren i Israel, og hvordan den bidrar aktivt til undertrykkelsen av det palestinske folk. Hun illustrerer også hvordan israelske høyere utdanningsinstitusjoner helt avhengig av samarbeid, både faglig og finansielt, med vestlige aktører for å operere. Winds forskning har vært veldig viktig for alle oss som mener at det dermed nødvendig å kutte de institusjonelle båndene til eller mellom våre egne institusjoner og de israelske, for å sørge for at ikke også vi aktive bidragsytere til et system som vi tar avstand fra. So, on behalf of Klassekampen and SAIH, I would like to welcome up on the stage Maya Wind and Olav Elgvin. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Selma, and thank you, Maya, for being here with us tonight. So, we are going to talk about this book, Towers of Ivory and Steel. And we don't have much time. So, Maya, I will go straight to the point and ask you, why did you write this book?
Thank you, Olav, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. It's great to be here in Oslo. It has been 11 months, and we have not even reached a ceasefire. And as we sit here in this wonderful space full of books, I want to just begin by acknowledging that well over 60% of the bookshops in the Gaza Strip have been utterly destroyed by Israeli aerial bombardment, along with, as it was said in the introduction, every single Palestinian university in the Gaza Strip, reducing them all to rubble. This is what, as was said also, but Karman Abulsi and intellectuals across Palestine have long called scholasticide. It's Israel's very intentional war on Palestinian centers of education as a means to subdue the Palestinian liberation movement. And one of what brought me to write this book is to try to understand how is this scholasticide, how is this war on Palestinian education sustained. And I've spent my years at the university as a scholar investigating how global systems of militarism and policing are reproduced, with a particular focus on how Israelis labor to sustain colonial violence. And I am myself also a Jewish Israeli, the granddaughter of genocide survivors. And so long before I ever entered the university as a space, I was concerned with the question of genocide, with how it is that some of us come to understand the possibility of our lives as bound up with the death of others. A question no less relevant to those of us inhabiting other settler states, such as Canada, the United States, and others, or as in your case, imperial metropoles. But nonetheless, I think the ongoing genocide, or the escalation of the genocide in Gaza, part of a, of course, decades-long project of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians by the Israeli state, I think brings us back to the urgency of this question, and in particular, those of us based at universities, whether we labor for the university system, whether we are students, or in any other way entangled in the university system. We must attend to the question of scholasticide and to the destruction of Palestinian education. And I think this is a particularly important question for us in the West, because in the Western academic community in particular, Israeli universities have long been celebrated and held up as exceptional, right, in the broader landscape of the Middle East. Our universities, including until recently here in the city of Oslo, and I know there are others that still maintain such ties, but more broadly, Western universities have bestowed upon Israeli universities an exceptional status. They give them opportunities for joint funding, student exchange programs, joint collaborations of all kinds. There's Horizon Europe funding that is available to Israeli universities that is not available to almost any other country outside the EU. So these are just some of the examples of ways that Israeli universities have been singled out, if you will, for special treatment by the Western academic community. And this despite the fact that Palestinian civil society organizations, scholars, activists, students have for over 2 decades called this Western consensus into question, right? So PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, first issued its call to boycott the Israeli Academy in 2004. And I really came to write this book in response to that question posed by civil society in Palestine 20 years ago, which is quite simply, are Israeli universities complicit in the violation of Palestinian rights?
Thank you, Maya. Before we go into details on what you write in the book, a little bit about how it's written. Because you have obviously a very strong personal story. Your grandparents were like Holocaust survivors, etc. And the thing is, in Norway, if you go to a publishing house and you say you want to write a book, they will always say you need to bring in your personal story. You need to write about yourself. Not always, but quite often. Here you do exactly the opposite. It's written in a very, I would say, impersonal way, in a objective manner. It's almost detached. And we don't get to know you as a person in this book. Can you say a bit about why you chose to write the book in that way?
Yes, this was a very intentional choice, to be sure. I did write, like any critical scholar, I begin by acknowledging my positionality, by situating myself in relation to this work. I think that is important for transparency, to situate oneself and to critically reflect on one's own positionality and one's access to the data in question. But I really wanted to lead with the data, and this is because Palestinian scholars, both those based in Palestinian universities in the occupied Palestinian territory and those based in Israeli universities, have for some time, in addition to PACB and civil society organizations, written about and produced a rich body of scholarly work about the nature of Israeli universities, about what it is like to produce knowledge and to write under the aegis of Zionist institutions in Israel, and what it is like to be a student there. And this research is not very engaged, not nearly enough, in the Western academic community, despite much of it being in English, published in Western journals. And so one thing that I made sure to cite this research in this book, and I really wanted to to ensure that more people come to read that research. But the other portion of this book is written on the basis of my own research, which I conducted in Israeli state and military archives, the university libraries themselves of Israel's 8 major public universities, where I looked at official state documents, unpublished government reports, doctoral and master's theses, and also my own. I'm trained as an ethnographer. I conducted extensive research in the campuses of Israeli universities themselves, accompanying Palestinian student organizers, interviewing Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian faculty, witnessing and observing for myself events and protests and discussions. And really what I wanted to do in this book is to really lead with the facts and lead with the data, because I think that too often, especially vis-a-vis the question of Palestine, one of the ways that the Palestinian liberation movement gets delegitimized is through an unwarranted attention to the personal rather than the political. This is a political issue, and so is the genocide in Gaza. And so I wanted to really ensure that people, rather than engaging with who I was or my story, actually evaluate the data for themselves. This is data that now it's an act of translation, and I wanted the international academic community in particular to be able to assess for themselves what are Israeli universities. And so that's why I led with the data.
Okay. Thank you. Moving on to kind of what you write about in the book. It's a very rich book, as I said, very kind of well argued. It's very kind of data rich, and lots of things are, I think, surprising to many people. Even to me, who had been following the conflict for like more than 2 decades, there were lots of things which surprised me. And one of the things which surprised me was about my own field of research. I do research in the field of Islam in Norway, Islam in Europe, and this field is quite often, at least in Europe, seen as non-political. It's a kind of bunch of old guys reading old Arabic manuscripts, and nobody thinks of these old guys as political. They are kind of the stereotype of this detached academic who just sits in the ivory tower and doesn't engage with the real world. Sometimes it's true, it has to be said. But what you show in your book is that, or you argue that in Israel, even kind of this so-called detached, non-political Oriental studies, Islamic studies, is very closely connected to the state, the authorities, the military. Can you say a bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. I think for those of us inhabiting the academy, it is so important to really attend to the material conditions that make our knowledge production possible. And if we take seriously universities as sites of knowledge production, the critical question that those of us who are trying to think critically about the university itself must ask ourselves is, what are the material conditions that enable us to produce this knowledge? Who are we funded by? And what is it our knowledge and our data put in service of? And that is a critical question for all of us in any university system, but certainly in the Israeli context. And in the Israeli context, what I really found, and what I write about in the book too, is the ways in which entire disciplines in the Israeli academy developed in and through deep collaborations with the Israeli military government, with the Israeli security state, and that you really cannot understand entire fields of the Israeli academy absent these deep ties. So, you talked about Middle East studies. Middle East studies as an academic field in Israel developed through the collaboration with the military government over Palestinians. And it really became a site itself for the state to hone the sort of linguistic and regional expertise that it required to sustain apartheid rule over decades. And also Middle East studies departments themselves actually train active duty soldiers in Arabic and in other regional expertise in order to better carry out the labor of occupation. That's true for other fields as well. Archaeology developed as such a field where through the discipline of archaeology, through the Israeli state legitimated and gave scientific basis for its biblical narratives and claims to the entirety of the land of historic Palestine. Sites of excavation, of archaeological research themselves became mechanisms for Palestinian dispossession and continual Jewish settlement expansion. That's true also in the field of legal studies and ethics. That's a particularly important one to attend to the last 11 months, because the field of legal studies and ethics really developed interpretations of international humanitarian law and laws of war to sanction not only what is now known to us, what we all knew, but the ICJ recently made official, is a permanent and illegal military occupation, but also to really sanction a whole host of war crimes, including extrajudicial assassinations, torture, and disproportionate use of force against civilian populations, particularly in Gaza. So if we are to understand the impunity with which Israel has been operating over the last 11 months, we must look to Israeli universities.
Because like you mentioned ethics, because ethics and philosophy is another academic field which is often seen as being in a way detached from the world and being just not political. But in Israel you say that it is.
I believe that there's no such thing as apolitical knowledge production, right? But in the Israeli case in particular, this knowledge production is put in direct service to an illegal apartheid rule and now genocide.
I see. And one more field you write about in the book is criminology. And like in Norway, I think it's fair to say that criminology and sociology is often viewed as a somewhat leftist discipline, like an oppositional discipline in opposition to the state and to oppression. But you argue in your book that in Israel, it's almost the opposite.
Right.
Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the Israeli context, the Israeli police operates alongside the Israeli security agency, which is the Shin Bet, and the Israeli military as a key governing apparatus that sustains the apartheid regime. And this is very typical, right, of any colonial administration. Policing, that sort of the boundary between what is police and what is military is very porous. And this is also the case in Israel. And specifically in the case of Israeli criminology as a field, it also was put in direct service of military rule through collaborations both with the Israeli police itself and also with the Israeli security agency, not only by turning data collected through illegal methods of interrogation and torture into admissible evidence that can be used in the Israeli military court system, the conviction rate of which is over 99%. Right? So another key way that the Israeli state has tried to subdue the Palestinian liberation movement is through criminalizing it, criminalizing any sort of campus activity, but any sort of political activity more broadly. And so you see a project of mass incarceration over decades of military occupation by the Israeli state that the field of criminology in Israeli universities directly serviced. The leading department of criminology in Israel, which is at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, not only has it trained the leadership of both the Israeli security agency and the Israeli police, not only does it continually operate a specialized, tailored degree program for police officers, again, to carry out the work of illegal occupation, it also obtains data for their research collected through torture, which is absolutely unacceptable, not only in legal terms, but also for any university. This would be absolutely illegitimate as a form of research. And so in all of these ways, the discipline of criminology sanctions and legitimizes an illegal regime.
I think you mentioned these disciplines like criminology and like humanities, Islamic studies, but I think maybe the biggest part of the book is about how the weapons industry and the army cooperates very closely with at least parts of the Israeli academy. What kind of cooperation is that in more detail?
So I think it is important to understand the extent of this collaboration. Israeli universities birthed Israel's military industries. And this actually even predates the Israeli state itself. So the Haganah militia was the leading militia of the Zionist movement, later became the foundations of what is today the Israeli military. The first 3 universities established by the Zionist movement were established already beginning in 1918 and then onward into the 20s and 30s. The Haganah operated and opened a science corps that operated on the basis of these 3 campuses. And through this science corps, faculty and students themselves directly participated in the development and manufacture of weapons, very explicitly to aid in the project of Palestinian expulsion in the Nakba, in the 1948 war, when over 2/3 of the Palestinian population were expelled from historic Palestine. And this is the origin story, really, of Israel's military industries, because it's originally Israeli military industries were fully state-owned. So, and now they are partially so, but you have Rafael, Elbit Systems, Israel Aerospace Industries. These were actually birthed on Israel's campuses. And both military, industry, and academic leaders speak very openly to the fact that Israeli campuses operate as critical laboratories for the development of weaponry and technologies used against occupied Palestinians and then now exported abroad as battle-proven. And this is true also of technologies developed and tried for the very first time in the genocide in Gaza over the last 11 months, some of which have already been put on display in Singapore and in other international expos as field tested.
But so do they actually use the words like field tested or battle proven, or is it something you say?
Absolutely. This is actually the terminology of Israeli military industries themselves. Rafael actually calls itself the National Laboratory of Israel. And this is true to its origin story and to how it was birthed in the Technion.
Yeah. So this was one of the things in the book which kind of I almost couldn't believe. It sounded bizarre to me that they are going abroad and saying that this has been kind of field tested. But you say that they actually go abroad to kind of conferences or where they try to sell their weapons, and they say that this has been proven on Palestinian, it works.
Absolutely. Not only is it readily available, this information is verifiable and you can see it on their own websites, in their English brochures. I have spent many hours, many more than I would like, in Israeli and international weapons expos, where all of these companies display their technologies and weaponry, and this is openly advertised. And this is in fact the leadership of Israeli military industries in the international arena. Is precisely based on the occupied Palestinian territory as its laboratory.
And all of these, or at least most of these companies, have clear ties to the academy, to universities and think tanks, etc.
Yes, every single one, absolutely. Yeah.
I see. But moving on, because I think your book is very convincing, I think. But what seems to be the case, though, which you don't write so much about, is that there are clearly some academics, intellectuals in Israel who do take a stand against oppression, against the occupation, and many of them are based at the universities. So isn't this a part of the picture which you don't really go into in your book?
So first of all, I want to clarify, and I urge everyone here who hasn't already, go and read the guidelines put forward by PACB, which really outline to all of us in the international community how it is that we are to go about instituting this boycott. This is an incredibly principled, deeply thought out, and very clear political document. So all of us should be reading it. It's available. But the call for the academic boycott as issued by PACB is a call for an institutional boycott. It is not directed at individuals. And this is because the focus is on the institutional accountability of Israeli universities in Israel's, what they called at the time in 2004, regime of oppression against Palestinians, but we can openly call it today, right? The apartheid regime and now genocide. So in the broadest sense, it doesn't actually matter who inhabits the Israeli universities or what particular opinions they have or what parties they vote for, so long as institutionally their universities are put in direct service of apartheid rule. Having said that, they would not be able to do that and to operate in service of the Israeli state in the ways that they do were it not for the broad, not only consent, but also active participation of the vast majority of Israeli faculty, staff, and students. So I think that's incredibly important to say. And the other thing to mention, perhaps, is to really turn this question back around and ask for how long are Palestinians meant to wait for their liberation? Are they meant to wait another few decades for these ostensible leftists in the Israeli academy to make enough of an impact so that there is a mass movement in Israel as well that joins the Palestinian liberation movement? And it should be said also, PACB has explicitly invited what they called Israelis of conscience to join the movement. And so there's nothing barring Israelis from joining the Palestinian liberation movement to advocate for freedom and equality for everyone living from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Such a movement does not exist yet, and this is what we must do. This is where the international community must step in, and international civil society in particular, because, and I think it is incredibly clear to all of us especially in the last 11 months. We cannot wait any further.
But if I may kind of push you a bit here further, Maya, like I see your point, but let's assume that there is 1%, 5%, 2% of Israeli academics who in principle can take part in a liberation movement for Jews and Palestinians in Israel-Palestine. Isn't there a danger that a boycott can create a pushback for them and make it even more difficult for them to operate, even more difficult for them to raise their voice, etc.? Or do you think that a boycott can, in some ways, actually help them to become more vocal, more courageous in their activism?
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe very much that the only way to empower the movement is through this international intervention. And I think we're all students of history here. And there is just not a single solitary case in the history of the last 500 years of European colonialism where we have seen decolonization happen solely from the volition of the colonizers. That just simply never has happened. There always needs to be an external force, right? And the BDS movement precisely seeks to create such a force. And this is where all of us in the international community and civil societies can play and must play an important role. And I think it is really, again, if we are students of history looking at the South African case, on the basis of which that has in many ways inspired the BDS movement, right? In the South African case, there were some, not enough, but some white scholars and students in historically white universities that joined the call and heeded the call from the ANC to push to sever the ties of their universities from the regime of apartheid. It can be done and it must be done. And what PACB and the Union of Palestinian University Professors and Employees, as well as every single Palestinian student university union, have reiterated the call to all of us in the international academic community over the last year to heed the call for boycott, to hold Israeli universities accountable for Palestinian unfreedom, for their role in facilitating Palestinian unfreedom. And what they are asking us as the international community to do is to guide Israeli scholars, students, and staff to do what white South African scholars did at the time, which is to sever ties between their universities and Israel's regime of apartheid.
That's because I think what people in Norway quite often say, if you propose a boycott or sanctions, etc., is that this will make it more difficult for change to happen from the inside in Israel. They will say that, okay, so if we do boycott, this will just kind of make Israelis react in some kind of backlash movement, and it will make it even more difficult for change to happen from within. But what you're actually saying is that you don't believe in change happening from within, at least not without large pressure from the outside. Is that correct?
That is correct. And also, again, I want to remind everyone here, Israel has been, for the last 11 months, committing a genocide. There is mass starvation. Every single hospital has been bombed, every single university, countless schools. We are now, so Israeli society is currently gripped with a genocidal fervor, right? That is fact. And Israeli universities and those who inhabit them are no exception. And we are now in a genocide. There is no worse crime. There cannot be a more acute moment than the moment that we are now in. And if we as an international community don't step in precisely because of the utter failure of the international legal system, the highest courts of the world, to hold Israel to account, to put an end to this genocide instead of just litigating whether or not it exists in retrospect, this is what we must do right now. The Israeli university system is a critical pillar sustaining not only apartheid but now genocide, and we must destabilize that pillar urgently.
I see. But what is also, I think, striking in your book is that you show some examples where actually some of the times when Israeli universities actually start showing some level of solidarity with the Palestinians is quite often when they felt a kind of the heat or a danger from boycott happening. Can you say a bit about that?
Right. So first of all, just a reminder again, as every single Palestinian university in Gaza has been destroyed and reduced to rubble, not one single Israeli university administration had one word to say. not one called on the Israeli government to cease the bombing of every Palestinian campus or to end the raids on Birzeit and every university campus in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. They had not one word to say. They had 11 months to say something. They have never stood up for the academic freedom or the right to education of their Palestinian colleagues just a few kilometers away. So this has never happened. So this is one thing that we must attend to in terms of, again, holding Israeli universities to account. But it is true that, for example, when the Israeli military government in 2022 issued a new set of regulations to try and further stifle Palestinian universities, including through isolating them and limiting the number of international students and faculty who are allowed to enroll, what kinds of textbooks or materials are allowed to enter their campuses, when they issued a set of even further draconian measures, when Israeli universities were initially asked to respond, the Committee of Israeli University presidents said, this is a political matter, we don't engage with this question of how the Israeli military government governs the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Then, a few months later, when there was an international outcry, and suddenly Israeli university heads had a very different take, right? When there was increasing calls for a boycott, and the international community rose up, even the U.S. government wanted to intervene. Then suddenly they had a different story to tell. Then they thought it was within their purview to say something about it. But even then, it was very clear it was about self-preservation. And they when they wrote the Ministry of Defense at the time, they specifically said, "This is going to fuel the BDS movement. It will come back to us like a boomerang." That is how they said it. But again, it just shows you that it is only when there is international pressure, and we've seen this especially now in the last 11 months, where there is incredible growing traction for the academic boycott, including here in Norway, where there has been significant gains. Only then do Israeli universities ever respond in some capacity to the question of academic freedom for Palestinians, and more broadly to the question of Palestinian liberation.
I think that you may be right that you're right that there are no universities who have said that, like, please end the war and the genocide. But there was, I think, one letter which was signed from quite a few academics where they were asking for an end to the war and also saying we need to think about Palestinian lives, etc. I don't remember exactly how many people signed it, but it was a kind of sizable number of academics who signed it. But I think in this letter they also mention the kind of specter of boycott. They mentioned that if we don't do anything now, suddenly people will boycott us. Which seems to kind of, and this was of course after your book came out, but it seemed to in some way validate your argument that it's only when there is pressure from the outside that Israeli academics try to step up.
Yes, and it's also important again to say that there is an immense gulf between what Israelis are willing to entertain and Palestinian basic demands. Palestinians have called for a boycott and the BDS movement, not just academic, but in all spheres, until the core rights of the Palestinian society are respected, including the right of return, the end of the military government, full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. The demands from Palestinian civil society are incredibly clear. They're also grounded in international law. And Israelis overall, not only in the universities, refuse to engage with these core demands. So this is precisely why they have turned to the international community, to the international civil society, to say, help us hold Israelis to account until these core rights of ours are respected. And so nothing less than that is acceptable. These are the core demands of Palestinian society, and until Israeli universities and Israeli society more broadly acknowledges and accepts these core demands and respects these core rights, there is really nothing to talk about in terms of any left movement in Israeli society or in the university system.
Interesting. And because I think what you say is, if you discuss with like Norwegian friends of Israel, and you say things like what you're saying now, then they will quite often bring up examples like, for example, the University of Haifa, where there is a sizable number of Palestinian students. And they will say, if it's as bad as this crazy Maya Wind says, how come there's so many Palestinian students studying in Haifa? How do you respond to that kind of argument?
So I think it's really important to situate the university in the broader project of Israeli ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, right? Because post the Nakba, the only region where there was still a Palestinian citizen majority living who had survived and remained the Nakba was in the Galilee. And actually, Israel built the University of Haifa as a pillar of regional demographic engineering to interrupt the territorial contiguity of Palestinian citizens of the Israeli state itself. And so actually, the founding of the university itself was part of a depoliticizing device and a deterritorializing device of the Israeli state. It is also important to say that the mere presence of Palestinians on Israeli campuses says nothing about what their rights are on these campuses. And this too is right out of the South African playbook, right? South African apartheid universities also pointed to the mere presence of Black students and faculty as somehow indicative of the fact that there was not an apartheid rule. But we have to also understand that in the early days of the Israeli state, between 1948 and 1966, Palestinian citizens themselves, or those who became Palestinian citizens, were themselves under military rule, right? And at that time, the Israeli state explicitly debated whether or not to grant access to these Palestinians under military rule to their institutions of higher education. And ultimately, when Palestinians were granted access to Israeli universities, this was partially as a mechanism to lower their birth rate, because there was the idea in the Israeli government that, particularly for Palestinian women, granting them access to higher education would aid in lowering their birth rate. So even the entry of Palestinian citizens to the Israeli university system was part of Israel's demographic calculus. Right? And that's true for the campus itself, and that's true for the University of Haifa, and that's also true for the very entry of Palestinian students. And then we have to look at what kinds of, what are Palestinian students and staff and faculty allowed, and scholars allowed on these campuses. And what we see is that their critical scholarship is disallowed, particularly pertaining to the Nakba, right? So the most core foundational research questions from the Palestinian perspective begins with the Nakba. One cannot understand Palestinian society anywhere without the Nakba. And Israeli universities have systematically disallowed and repressed critical research on the Nakba. So that's just one thing in terms of the research. But then also for students. Because Palestinian education and granting access to education for Palestinian university students in particular has been a great source of anxiety for the Israeli state. Israeli universities worked in total collaboration with the Israeli government and military government, starting in 1948 until the present moment, to surveil and closely monitor Palestinian students on their campus. Not only have they been suspending their student groups, Palestinian student groups, routinely, not only have they been using disciplinary committees as a mechanism to continually repress Palestinian liberation on their campuses, but now, and this has escalated tremendously over the last 11 months, they are now directly working with the Israeli police and Israeli security agency to call on them to come and arrest their students and to collaborate with them, sometimes on the basis just of their social media posts, right? So there is incredible policing of Palestinian students doing any sort of mobilization on Israeli campuses, those calling out against the genocide, or more broadly, mobilizing for Palestinian liberation. So that's really important to not conflate the mere presence of Palestinians with what they are allowed and as soon as they set foot on an Israeli campus.
And speaking about Israel and Israelis, what I would like to know is the things you say here to us. How much do the ordinary Israelis know about these things? And just to give a personal example, I grew up in Jerusalem, and what was also strange for me when reading your book is that I was reading about the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which was very close to where I grew up. And when I was a kid, I went to it was in a way a school for nerds, or not an extracurricular thing for nerdy kids. They didn't call it that, but that's what it was at the university, where you could learn about science and different things, where I went for some strange reason. I don't know why, but in any case, I was there, and and I loved this space. And then there was a Palestinian village close by called Isawiya, and for me it was you had the village, and you had the university, and these were separate, and you had these poor Palestinian kids, and then you had this university, which was a lovely place of knowledge and things like that, where you also had some Palestinians around. But what you write in your book is that this university was basically built on lands which belonged to Isawiya, and that they have been ever since just encroaching more and more and more. And I'm like, I had no idea. I had no idea then, and I actually didn't have any idea almost until now. And now I've become a very, critical pro-Palestinian adult, and I had no idea. So what I'm wondering is like, how many of these things are widely known in the Israeli public?
So I think, so first of all, as you mentioned, Hebrew University Mount Scopus, like almost every Israeli university campus, was built itself not only on the lands, on expropriated lands of Palestinian communities, but also the campuses serve as pillars of continual Palestinian dispossession. And this is true for many campuses. It's true for the first university, which is Hebrew University Mount Scopus, as much as it's true for the latest accredited university, which is Ariel University, built in the heart of an illegal settlement of Ariel, in the heart of the occupied West Bank. And we really need to understand that for over a century, beginning with Hebrew University Mount Scopus, established in 1918, very strategically so, at the apex of Mount Scopus, overlooking the entire city of Jerusalem to stake not only symbolic but also material and political claim to the entire city for the Zionist movement. That is just as true 100 years later with Ariel University in the occupied West Bank, where again the campus itself serves as a pillar of Israel's planned annexation of the West Bank, and the expansion and accreditation of the university goes hand in hand, very explicitly and intentionally so, with the expansion of Israeli sovereignty and Israeli military rule in the occupied West Bank. So Israeli universities, and this is true in their charters, and this is openly declared, these are Zionist institutions. Most recently, when Hebrew University suspended its most critical Palestinian scholar, Professor Nadira Kevorkian, for her critical research on what she calls unchilding, Israel's engaging of Palestinian children as combatants. And her outspoken research and advocacy against the genocide and for Palestinian liberation and against Israeli colonial violence. For years, Professor Kevorkian has been harassed and intimidated by her own administration. They fueled a campaign against her that ended in her recent arrest and her suspension, and now she has finally, after years, although she was tenured, has left Hebrew University. In the initial letter, when the university administration wrote to her, this is back in March, the Hebrew University administration declared, "We are a Zionist university. It is unacceptable to us that you identify as an anti-Zionist and do all this critical research." So we really have to take Israeli universities at their word. This is openly stated. Israeli universities are Zionist. This is true in their charters. This is true in their curricula. This is true in the physical design of their space that substantiates Israeli state narratives and celebrates Israeli war criminals, right, in the hallways, right? And the campuses itself are militarized fortresses. And this is also not only the institution, but actually students are participating in this. So specifically at Hebrew University, there is a history, an ongoing history, of the Jewish Student Union and Jewish student groups advocating for more policing of Isawiya, the neighboring Palestinian community in occupied East Jerusalem, partially on whose lands this university now sits. To continue to expand the policing of this neighborhood so as to safeguard, right, Israeli students. So this is not just the institution, this is actually also the people who inhabit it, whether they're staff, faculty, or students. This is a project in which Israelis broadly participate. These institutions do not reproduce colonial violence on their own. There are humans who occupy these institutions, who make these institutions, and they are the ones who are actively facilitating apartheid.
So going back to my question, do you think that lots of people in Israel actually know about this? That it's not something which is kind of hidden away, and like that they are not duped by, I don't know, evil politicians or media moguls, just kind of, but that they actually, they kind of are aware to a certain extent of what happens, but they think it's okay.
It is worse than that, actually, because what Israelis are not doing, it's not just a question of awareness, it is a question of active participation. Not only do we have a draft, in the last 11 months, we are seeing the end result of decades of dehumanization of Palestinians by Israelis that have enabled this mass slaughter and the mass starvation of Palestinians in Gaza, and also, of course, the escalated attacks on Palestinian communities and killing in the West Bank. But we have to understand that this genocide that we're seeing in Gaza is just an escalation of a decades-long project. Genocide is structural to the Israeli state. The Israeli state is a project premised on the elimination of Palestinians and their replacement by Jewish Israelis. That is the only way to achieve a Jewish majority in a land inhabited by Palestinians. There is no other way. So genocide is in the DNA of the state of Israel. And what we are seeing now with the latest iteration of the project to depopulate Gaza, this is also has not begun 11 months ago. This is decades in the making. And we are now just seeing a horrific escalation of a decades-long project in which Israelis, they're not only aware of it, they are actively participating in it. Who is carrying out this genocide?
But if I can push back a little bit, Maya, isn't it nevertheless the case that this kind of genocidal intent on the part of ordinary Israelis, that it's fueled by a real sense of being under attack, of being victims in some sense? That it, because I think that we probably agree on many things, but I think it's fair to say that the situation in Israel is much worse now than it was 20 years ago. That in the 90s you had peace movement, you had, people didn't want to kind of de-Judaize Israel as such, but they did want to create a Palestinian state. There was a substantial movement for making a Palestinian state. And currently this movement is completely dead, it's completely non-existent. So something happened, and isn't it at least the case that things have gone from bad to worse, and that this has at least partly has to do with a real sense of being under attack from these violent Palestinians on the other side of the wall?
So again, I think we can only really understand the current genocide in Gaza, and really more broadly that Israel's attempt to depopulate all occupied Palestinian territory of Palestinians. This project is continuous. It has been continuous from before 1948. We are just seeing now the logical conclusion of the Zionist project if it is allowed to run rampant and it is not curbed in any way or limited by the international community. This is just a logical end result of this project. This is what it has always led us to. There was no other way. There is no other way to sustain the Zionist project, to reproduce the Israeli state without, in some way, ethnically cleansing the entire region of Palestinians. So this is what we are seeing now. And so in that way, it is continuous. That nothing has fundamentally changed from, for the Israeli state project. And so I think that this is what all of us must account for, is that for decades the international community has enabled this project to continue unimpeded, and it has led us to this point. This impunity is decades in the making, because we have failed as an international community to intervene in the root cause of this problem, the root cause of Palestinian unfreedom and subjugation, which is Zionism. There is no way to have liberation for the people of this land under a Zionist rule.
But what does that mean in practice? Because I think if there are any, Zionist, Jewish Israelis here, I think some of them would maybe feel a bit threatened by what you're saying. What does it mean in practice that there is no Zionism?
This is true, and also to your earlier question. Historically, and still today, in settler colonial states, settlers are often feeling besieged. That is often the narrative. That was true of whites in South Africa. That was true of the settlers in North America and Australia, New Zealand. This is a constant narrative that we hear. But this is not. But we must also understand that the zero-sum game produced by the structure of settler states, wherein the indigenous people have to die in order for the settlers to live. This is a construction. We must interrupt this construction. Palestinians need not die in mass for Israelis to live. That is the construction of the Israeli state. And what we must do is to understand that everyone between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea can and must live, and must thrive, and must live in full dignity and equality and freedom. But the only way to do this is to decolonize and to dismantle the Zionist regime.
So everybody means I see. Thank you, Maya, for your strong and inspiring words. I think we soon we need to wrap up, but I think what we need to talk about before leaving here is also the context in Norway. As I say, there have been some gains in Norway, but no universities have adopted a boycott. And actually the institutions who have done what may look like a boycott, they are quite often pointing out this is not a boycott.
The specter of boycott.
Yeah, so,
haunting.
And the argument which often comes up is the argument from academic freedom. That people are saying that, of course, we understand that things are bad in Israel and Palestine. We understand that Israeli universities may not be perfectly, liberal, humanist, etc. But at the same time, we have a duty to uphold academic freedom for our researchers, for ourselves, for a student, and making a statement here can have all kinds of consequences. Suddenly there will be no end to what demands people are making. People might even demand that Norwegian universities should stop having funding from oil companies. The horror.
God forbid.
Yeah. So that's the argument which often is made. How do you respond to that kind of argument?
So I want to begin, I'm an academic. I wholeheartedly agree that academic freedom is a foundational value. It is the bedrock of the university. Without academic freedom, we have no universities, right? But I want to offer that the academic boycott is the only way to achieve academic freedom. Ours, right, is the only movement for true academic freedom for everyone inhabiting both Palestinian and Israeli universities, everyone between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Only through the boycott will they all access education and academic freedom in a full way. So long as Israeli universities service apartheid rule, there cannot be academic freedom. Not only for Palestinian scholars and students, but even for critical or anti-Zionist Jewish Israelis, right? There is no academic freedom now, but there can be if we decolonize our universities and disentangle them from Israel's regime of apartheid, from settler colonial rule, and from structurally supporting and committing to genocide in Gaza. But I also want to say, for the Norwegian context, I think organizing for the boycott is not merely for Palestinians, it is also crucial for your rights, your academic rights and your academic freedom here in Norway, right? Because, we heard it first on the streets of Cairo. It has still since been echoed across the world. When people were chanting, protesters were chanting, "We are not liberating Palestine, Palestine is liberating us." That is no less true for all of us here in Norway. And I think the student encampments and the student movement across all of our campuses in Norway and elsewhere have really shown us, I think, that it is not only urgent that all of us commit to the Palestinian liberation movement, but that it is only through committing to organizing for Palestinian liberation that all of us on all of our campuses can also be truly free.
But if I may challenge you for one more point, Maya, that because I think after reading a book, it's very difficult to come away and still think that Israeli universities are a critical solidarity force in Israel. I think that's the case, that it's very difficult to come away, finish your book, and still think in that way. But then again, where do you draw the line? For example, some Norwegian universities have cooperation with Chinese universities. And I don't think they are either, academic freedom is not held in supremely high regard in China, I think it's fair to say. So why should Norwegian universities engage in boycott against Israeli universities, but not against China?
Yeah, that is a question we frequently hear, right? We begin with Israeli universities, where does it end? So I would like to suggest that perhaps it's actually a question we take seriously and say, should we, just like our universities, as students across the world, including here, are demanding, should all of our universities not only have a filter, an ethical filter and framework for investments, right, for the university investments, but why should there not be such a filter for academic collaborations as well? Our universities should only collaborate with other institutions of higher learning where the basic academic freedoms of all students are respected. This is not the case in Israel. Israel absolutely does not meet that threshold. But I think it's also, and nor do maybe other countries, and that's important to attend to. But I also think it's important to say Israeli universities are settler universities in much the same way that universities in the United States, Canada, South Africa, Australia are settler universities. But there are some really important cardinal differences here. And the first and most primary one is that although many of our universities, including Norwegian universities, were built through the spoils of the slave trade, right, or of European colonialism, they were built on expropriated lands, and they are entangled in all sorts of ways in colonial violence. That's true of all of our universities. It is not the case that every one of our university systems or the universities that Norwegian universities collaborate with are structurally embedded in regimes that are now overwhelmingly understood and recognized and acknowledged by the international community as regimes of apartheid. That legal designation has to mean something to us, and that is true of Israeli universities in ways that it is not true of every university system embedded in violence. But to me, the more foundational question is really who is calling for it? Because to my mind, the most important question is, what are the indigenous peoples and others who are subjected to the violence of our respective colonial universities calling for? In the Israeli context, the communities most directly impacted by the violence of Israeli universities, which are the Palestinians, they have asked for a boycott. And that should be enough for us to heed that call. And so for me, it begins and it ends there.
So the moment that, for example, Chinese dominated peoples or oppositional activists, the moment they start calling for a boycott of Chinese universities, then we might go to that and take that step. That's
Absolutely.
what you're saying.
I'm sure that the global left would rise up to that occasion and respond to that call if there were in fact a case made that other university systems are directly servicing the elimination and subjugation of indigenous peoples. Absolutely. We are not, and boycott, the BDS movement is calling for boycott as a tactic. The theory of change for the BDS movement is that, again, Israelis will not decolonize of their own volition. They must be compelled to do so by an external force, and it seeks to create such a force led by international civil society, across the world, to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people as they wage their liberation struggle.
Thank you, Maya. I think our time is almost up, but final question. Okay, so you published this book, now you're doing a tour in different countries. What's next for you in your career as an activist, scholar, researcher, etc.?
I think what's next for me is what is next for all of us, and the thing that most concerns all of us in this room, which is the immediate achieving of a permanent ceasefire, the dismantling of Israeli colonialism and apartheid rule, and true liberation for all, from Palestine to Norway and everywhere.
Thank you.